Hey everyone, welcome to the YouTube channel. I'm Joshua Gibson, obviously. This is Max Aita, also very obviously. And today we're going to record a video discussing programming for weightlifting. It's going to be a bit more of a practical video. We'll discuss how Max starts kind of from the top and works to the bottom and cover everything in between. So if you guys have any further questions after watching it, leave them down below. Please leave a thumbs up, subscribe, and we will start the video.
Yeah. Yeah. What? Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. What? Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
So when I'm designing any program for any sport, powerlifting or weightlifting, I always basically, the foundation is to go off of essentially the first principles, the scientific principles of training, which are specificity, overload, fatigue management, SRA, stimulus recovery adaptation, variation, and then phase, potentiation, and individual differences. So each one of these principles, there's kind of like groupings or corresponding principles, right? Variation and specificity are interlinked to some degree. Fatigue management and SRA are interlinked, as well as overload. But basically what we're doing is, and then on top of that, individual differences is essentially the box that determines the magnitude of any one of these things, or the contents of any one of those things. But understanding those first is kind of the biggest thing you need to have before building the program or building any program. So I don't want to explain all of them. There's plenty of videos out there as to where to learn them, how to like actually grasp this and do something with it. But I'll kind of go over basically like starting from the top, starting from specificity, really kind of how I apply or how I make a program, how I create something that's practical from that principle. And specificity basically just is the kind of like the barometer for which, what is an exercise that we choose and how it affects what we get as an adaptation. Mm-hmm. So if we're doing powerlifting, then low bar squats with maximum weight, the most specific. Obviously everything else is a further removed from that. When we're doing something too with weightlifting, especially with technical stuff, we want to look at like what exercises are the things that are going to fix the technique we want to develop. What exercises and what methods, as in the sets and reps, intensity, are best suited to develop the adaptations we want for that type of training we're doing. So 15 weeks out from national championships, you're not doing 1 rep max snatches. Mm-hmm. So that's not necessarily a thing you want to focus on. The most useful exercises there are the things that essentially build on each other, develop general qualities to get to the next level. So each phase of training is essentially, has its own goals that we're looking for from a adaptation standpoint. So the first thing I do with this is we really want to, what do we want to get to at the end of this? And what we want to end up with is a list of exercises ordered by largest magnitude, the thing we want to do the most. And because there's probably there's a lot that goes on as far as like when you understand the principles, you understand, you know, where things kind of fall into different places as far as overload and specificity being interconnected. And so, you know, if there's any point where I'm saying something that kind of connects two dots that I didn't mention, then you have to stop and ask. But essentially we want to create a list of exercises by magnitude, and magnitude is in the overload mechanism for that phase of training should be the largest. So if this is a general or hypertrophy block we're developing or building, then the magnitude, the largest, would be the highest volume session, right? So, you know, it's not going to be, let's say, snatch times 1, right? That's not necessarily going to be the largest magnitude. If also the list includes, you know, snatch, you know, times 5 reps, right? In hypertrophy, this is clearly lower magnitude, right? It's less of the overload mechanism, which is volume. So our list that we want to create here is essentially based on what we're trying to develop, what we're trying to build in an athlete. What are their weaknesses, right? So I'm kind of just gonna make a list that's sort of made up, and then we'll show you kind of a small process to how that goes. But it's a big thing to sort of build the actual like flow chart for deciding what exercise to do. But I can give you a little bit of an example. So anyways, the list we want to create, like, let's just say it's going to be this person is really bad in the transition, right? So hang snatch below the knee is the number one thing. Second thing is, you know, let's just say, you know, hang snatch from, or hang snatch. Let's say hang snatch, you know, below knee plus overhead squat, right? So they need some of that. And then finally, because in any one phase of training, we don't want to totally neglect someone's classical skill, we always include one of these exercise lists as something that's classic, right? This is not a hard and fast rule, but it's something that I've noticed with most of the skill level people we have. If you were like a class 1, 2, 3 lifter, this would make a lot of sense. You might even have 2 of these exercises as snatch. If you're a master of sport or above, then you might have no classic snatches in this early phase, because the definition between, or the break point between those two athletes, like intermediate versus advanced, is that an intermediate lifter has consistent problems and their technique is somewhat solidified, meaning they can remove, you know, snatch practice from training for a certain amount of time without decaying their skill in that exercise. Obviously, if they're doing like exercises at the same time, it's going to benefit them. An advanced lifter, someone above master of sport, might not have to do snatch to maintain that skill. They won't lose it, right? If I was to start squatting, well, let's assume I stopped squatting for years, and then I started squatting again, you know, 4 or 5 years later, I was advanced enough in that skill that my skill would come back really quickly. That's a more basic movement, but the idea would be if Ilya Ilin came back to training again, it's not going to take him very long to get back to his near perfect form again, right? He's going to know that skill immediately. So he can spend more time in these phases away from that, meaning that this list doesn't have to be composed of mostly classic exercises. So this is obviously like an early phase, right? We'll just call it hypertrophy. If I spell things wrong, just edit them out, blur it out, put something else over there. Notice be a lot spelled wrong. So let's say we have three sessions here, right? Or three exercises here. This list is really broken up into essentially 2 different lists. The first part of the list is what we call, well, actually, you know, let's skip that. That'll be for the overload session. I'm just trying to get it as basic as I can. So then let's say the next exercises we pick, we're gonna say, you know, because he also has trouble from below the knee, we'll put like a power snatch from below the knee, okay? Because it's a little bit lighter exercise, and then maybe even like something to work on the first pull, a tempo snatch. So this, I'm kind of jumping around on this a lot, but this list is our list of exercises we know we want to do. this list should correspond to the number of sessions we have in a week. So if we decide, hey, this lifter is going to train 5 times a week, right? Then we want to have 5 exercises, and 5 times a week in the snatch. It could be 4 times in the snatch. He could train 7 days a week, but only does snatch 5 times a week. So our list has to correlate to that. So we've got 5 exercises. These correlate to one of those days of the week, one of those sessions of the week, right? You have 5 different exercises.
Is there a way you would dictate frequency or choose frequency?
Yeah, so frequency is basically determined by a couple of things. First, in any high skill lift like snatch, clean and jerk, we want to ensure that we're getting the most possible practice. So we want to have the highest frequency we can get, while at the same time reducing the amount of fatigue any one of those sessions creates. So we don't want to have, we don't want to try and do 5 sessions of snatch if he can only recover from 3.
Right.
But we want to have the most possible sessions we can. If he's training 5 days a week and there's an opportunity to do a snatch, we're going to do something in there, right?
Gotcha.
Beneficial. As far as what these sessions are composed of, that's more the overload. So we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
But basically, we created this list, right? Additionally, with this list, we would also, move to the next block, right? Strength. And this is where the principle of variation comes in. Variation and phase potentiation. But, let's say to make this a simple program in the hypertrophy phase, let's say it's 4 weeks long. These are the exercises we're going to be doing for these 4 weeks. The sequence of what these exercises become afterward changes from phase to phase. So let's just make an example here and say that this hang snatch now becomes something that has to be slightly more specific, but still develops that component, right? That transition phase. So, hang snatch below the knee. Let's say because, to make this simple, this is really effective, we're going to keep doing it, right? So we keep this exercise the same for this phase, right? Hang snatch below knee. But then this complex we have, we don't need to spend as much volume on overhead squats. They're pretty good at it, but we need a little bit of work. So we're going to move this now to, let's say, a snatch plus hang snatch below knee. Okay? So now we've moved this to become slightly more specific, because if this was, a minimum 2 reps, one of them is now another hang snatch or a classic snatch. And then we leave this as snatch, right? So now you can see the C exercise was snatch, was somewhat specific. Same snatch, but we also have moved up this chain, up this list, to move more specific stuff towards the top of the list.
And like you said, the lettering, so the alphabetizing of it just indicates like the size of the session. So the hang snatch
Significance of the session.
is the significance,
Yeah.
which might imply like it's going to have more work.
Yeah, either size or intensity.
Gotcha.
Right, depending on what your overload mechanism is. It could even be that it's tempo or rest time, your density, right? These are the densest session. These are, whatever your overload mechanism is.
Right.
The sessions that are largest in the week end up at the highest point.
Gotcha.
Of this list.
That makes sense.
And then as we build this, so without building the entirety of it, you understand that now we sequence from this to this phase.
Right.
These things move over, right? Let's just say the technique workouts, these essentially just stay the same. We feel like those are the best option to do. And then we move into a peaking phase, right? Say peak. And this is where things kind of get a little bit different, but we would change the order of this now, because we know in peaking, the most significant thing, it's not peak, is going to be the classic exercises, right? Snatch, snatch again, and then let's say hang below knee. And this is much more rudimentary. I'm trying to use a limited number of things, right? And then our technique exercises, they just both become power snatch. Power snatch.
So how would you decide if those exercises should stay constant? Is it like, the technique keeps improving? Is it like we need more time with it, or?
Right, so let me get to that right after this, and then we'll kind of draw it out. But yeah, essentially, we build this sequencing of exercises. What is the path to move from one phase to the next? This is variation. This is how variation is applied in the program. Now, this is, what I would say more like the block style. There are long blocks of time, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever, then we change exercise, Excuse me. So it could be 2 weeks of this and then 2 more weeks. There could be 5 columns under hypertrophy if your hypertrophy phase is, 10 weeks long or something. Right? So you can sequence, you can rotate exercises as often as you want.
Right.
Understanding that there's a balance between directed adaptation and adaptive resistance, right?
Right.
Where if you are doing the same thing over and over again, right, you have the potential to run into adaptive resistance where the same exercise has a diminished effect on your results. And then if you're the opposite, if you're doing too much variation, you end up in a situation where there's no directed adaptation. So if you go from hang above the knee to the next week to hang below the knee to the next week to the floor, you're adding a lot of different exercises, and there's not as much stimulus being directed at the same movement over and over again. There's other factors in variation that come into play, which are essentially the sets and reps that exist within the program. So you could do the same exercise and have variation basically appear in the program because you change the structure of the workouts. Maybe the first week you have 5 sets of 3. The second week you have 8 doubles. The second week you have like 3, 2, 3, 2, right? So there's variation in that can exist as well. That's probably a little bit more detailed than what we can get into here. But essentially that's what we're talking about is here's the sequence, we know what we're gonna start with and we know where these are going. The 2 different lists I kind of talked about earlier, we wanna essentially divide these. And what these really do is this gives us the perspective as to what sessions are significant enough to drive results. And I would refer to these sessions as overload sessions, right? You could call them developmental, you could call them, whatever, big workouts. These workouts are significant enough in their overload mechanism that it is going to drive results, right? These sessions, the second list, is essentially what we would call, or I would call it technical sessions. Or you can call it a maintenance session or a light session. But really what it is it's not significant enough in its overload mechanism to further drive results, but it is significant enough in its stimulus to prevent the decay of whatever quality you're trying to prevent.
Right.
In our case with weightlifting, because our goal for frequency, right, is to maximize frequency so we can perfect technique as much as possible.
Right.
These sessions are generally going to be something that is highly technical in nature or allows us to focus on technique.
Right.
So the good example here as far as exercise selection that we can look at is something like a tempo snatch. You could max out the tempo snatch if you wanted to, right? But it's kind of not necessary, right?
Yeah.
And it's not well suited to it, right? Your tempo snatch for some people could be really, really light or really, really heavy, just depending on how you actually lift. But as a technique exercise, it's very well suited because it is relatively difficult, but lower absolute intensity, right? Things like power snatches, things like tempo snatches, no hook, no feet, those exercises are very well suited to technical sessions because one, you can increase relative difficulty of the session without increasing absolute load. So it satisfies both the ability to practice the technique with heavy weights and at the same time facilitates prevents technical decay without increasing fatigue to the point that you end up having these interruptions in the SRA curve.
So the only thing that would seem problematic to me is that this is like isolated to the snatch exercise. What happens when you start layering on like the magnitude or size of like the squats and the pulls and the clean and jerks?
Yeah, so that would be the principle of SRA, right? I can show sort of the process for how we come up with like basically a filtering system for exercises, or I can show kind of the SRA stuff if you want.
Sure, whatever you think makes sense.
I'll show you the SRA, right? So basically we have these lists created. Let's say snatch, clean and jerk, squat, pull, press, right? And we have A, B, C, D, E, F, A, B, C, D, E, F, me like miss one of the letters on the last one. Yep, you'll notice that my handwriting has been described as a psychopath. So we've created a list for all these things by this process. Right? Then what we would do is say, okay, we know we have 3 overload sessions for snatch. The principle that determines how many overload sessions we have is SRA, right? Snatch's SRA curve, and for those of you who don't know, you gotta watch a video, understand what SRA curve is gonna be shorter than clean and jerk.
Right.
Shorter than, whatever, back squat or something. But SRA curve is not limited to just an exercise. It's also essentially a like 3-dimensional object where there's an exercise, right, which influences the amount of tissue that's stimulated and the difficulty of it. So like a curl versus a deadlift. And then there's the load, the amount of weight on the exercise, and then there's the volume of that session, right? And so when we create our weekly program, let's call it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then we're gonna go snatch, clean and jerk, squat, press, pull, press. Okay? This is gonna be probably very sloppy. So there's another thing. Let's take hypertrophy for example. There's something we wanna factor into our training program which is called consolidation of stressors. And consolidation of stressors is sort of a piece of the SRA curve. When we have a snatch exercise that's A, we know its magnitude is large in its overload mechanism. We know that the exercise is somewhat challenging on that curve, somewhat of a time frame there. And we know the volume and intensity of that. But when we start adding other things on top of that in the same session, that SRA curve changes for that session, right? So if we say, hell yeah, I did my snatch session today, and then I did a maximum deadlift, 10 by 10 workout. But it was a SRA curve and the snatch is really short. Well, but the deadlift magnified that, so the training is huge. So what we want to do in hypertrophy is consolidation of stressors needs to occur throughout the program. So that's a changing variable. It's something that changes from the beginning phase to the end phase. We know that if we have consolidation of stressors early on, we can't consolidate them again.
Right.
We can't start with everything on the same days, the hardest on the same days, and total rest the next day because when we get to the peaking, we can't squeeze things together more. So we start with a more distributed plan.
So like stress would seem more consistent across the week and change as you get closer to a comp where it's like higher peaks and lower valleys.
Exactly,
basically.
and the reason for that is
that makes sense.
Is sort of an organically occurring thing because the SRA curve of this kind of work is shorter than this kind and this kind, right? And then the SRA curve of these sessions is very, very short, maybe even insignificant, right? So we're thinking, where do we place these these sessions? So as an example of what we do is we look at our weekly structure. Okay, so this is, let's just call this micro 1. We would say, okay, A snatch session is going on Monday. The B snatch session, the second hardest snatch training session of the week, there's 2 other days of the week, is going on Friday, okay? The C session, because we know it's still overload, we'll put that on Wednesday, okay?
Do you do this with every program? Do you start from this point and then, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so then the C session, or sorry, the clean and jerk, we would say, okay, what would give us a distributed version of stress across the week?
Right.
So instead of putting the A here, we put the A here, right? So now you have a hard Monday workout on snatch and a hard Wednesday workout on clean, but an easy snatch workout. Right. Let me actually put that in the spot it belongs. So A, and then we would put C, and then B, right? And what you end up with is a whole bunch of SRA curves, right? Because you can look at them and graph them out and look at where they would belong, theoretically. And then we look at the week and see how does that volume and intensity play out over that week, right? And we do the same with squats, pulls, presses, right? I don't think we need to write all of those.
Could you do squats?
Yeah, sure. So same thing with squats. Squats are a little bit different.
Yeah.
Because this list will probably look very different for squat.
Do you think it would be much different than like back, front, and then maybe close variations?
So let me erase this. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
So let's erase this as we do that. So with squatting, right? Squat sessions are not technically dependent, right? We don't need a lot of technique work to maintain our squat strength. If you're very, very strong at squatting,
Right.
you might have, back squat and then front squat. And then you have, back, front, back, or, it doesn't really matter the order of these because these are the only 2 overload sessions in the week.
Right.
All this is technical, okay? So, let's say, like for a power lifter, if I have a power lifter who's got, let's say, a 300 kilo squat, right? They might have 2 overload sessions in the week, and then they might have a second or third squat exercise. And I use weightlifting, so it's going to be like a front or back squat, but it could be like a split squat, or it could be a leg press or something like that, where it's not as significant as these 2, but it's our technique session, so the volume and intensity are relatively low, relatively manageable. It could be an overload session where it's also leg press that's really, really challenging, right? It's just the exercise is not dependent, it's the number of overload sessions.
How would you, so within this framework, how would you fit the squats in a way that it makes sense with the snatches and the clean and jerks?
Right, so that would the next step of this list, so we go back, right, front, just to make this easy, and let's say we're just gonna have 2 squats, which is probably unlikely, but 2 squats. In hypertrophy, right, when we get to overload, we show how we build an actual like table that represents overload. We would choose the largest volume. So let's say this workout's got 30 reps, right? Or let's say it's got 32 reps and there's sets of 8, right? And this has sets of 5 and there's 25 reps in, right? Or whatever those numbers are. Just easy to do. We would then be able to look at this and say the A squat workout belongs somewhere in here where it won't influence anything super negatively, right? So what are the days that, let's say Thursday is an off day, right? And then Saturday, Sunday's off. We could place that largest squat session either here or here because we know we're gonna have the next day. It's gonna have the least influence on that day, right? And there are many, many options to how to structure this, right? That's one example. And it's also one example where we have what you'd call like very concentrated workouts. All of our volume is split into 2 different sessions.
Yeah.
It's really unlikely we'd actually build workouts like that. A more practical example would be somebody who has, let's say, 3 overload sessions in squat, right? And it goes back, man, I'm terrible writing. Back, I haven't even written the words anymore, I just write the letter, because in my mind I'm going so much faster.
Sure, that's how it always is.
Right? And so then we say, okay, this is actually, 15, this is, 12, and then this is, 12 also.
Okay.
Total reps. And this is like, let's say, whatever, sets of 3, and then sets of 2, right? Or let's say that's sets of 3 also. So something very simple and rudimentary so we can understand. This is beneficial to us, much like we talked about having the highest frequency of training in the snatch. In hypertrophy, with our training volumes, if we get them too large in any one session, it starts to become this giant, like SRV cube in the middle of like if you put a giant ice cube in a drink, right? It displaces everything else and kind of messes it up. So if we have massive squat workouts or massive of any kind of workout, it messes things up in this phase. So we want to make sure that we're addressing hypertrophy's needs, a certain minimum amount of volume that we're going to start increasing as we progress, but in a way that's manageable. Now, if we spread this list out too far, and we tried to get like 6 workouts, and we divided the same volume up in there, these would start to fall below the threshold of effective training sessions. So if you had 6 sessions, but each of them was half the size of this, they would all essentially become technical or maintenance sessions where none of the sessions are really strong enough to drive you forward, but the total volume is still there. You're basically exhausting, you're inefficiently training. The session's
Right.
not hard enough to drive progress by itself, and the total volume ends up becoming like you kind of become. You're generating more fatigue than necessary to get the same result.
Right.
You're better off having these more consolidated to get the same progress. And so we do the same thing here. We just assign where do these go now. So it's probably in the same position. The squat probably going to go. The A session probably. It really depends on you as a coach what you want to do. You could put it here, the A session with your snatch, your heavy snatch, because that would create a more even distribution of these. And then your B and your C here, because if you look at these, right, you have relatively similar size sessions. If you don't like the fact that two front squats follow each other, you could put, the A here, the B here, C there. This process is something that as a coach you're going to decide. This is probably the thing that is kind of like when you look at different programs, you can see a coach's signature in the program a lot based on how they create the weekly structure.
Do you think it could be problematic if people fall into a certain pattern just because it's the way it's been done? So like I know there's like a very traditional pattern where it's like highest volumes, medium, like lower volumes, lower intensities, highest intensities, and then like strength work.
Sure, yeah. And you could also create something, this was common too, where people would have like the A snatch here, the A clean and jerk on Tuesday, right? And then you'd have like maybe C and C, or maybe C is on Thursday, right? And then, it's B snatch and then B clean and jerk. There's a huge number of possibilities, right? And what you want to do is take the principle of SRA and decide as you do this, am I maximizing the factors, the what I've created in this list, am I maximizing that to get the most out of what that athlete needs? A really strong lifter who's incredibly strong will have less overload sessions in a week than a really small, really weak lifter, right? Someone who recovers really quickly can do more overload sessions, right? Someone who's really, really strong will have to do somewhat less. And that might only be a difference between, 2 or 3, right? But if you're snatching 170, or let's say you're snatching 200 kilos, you're probably not doing significantly large sessions of that all the time. But you might be doing the same frequency of snatching as a smaller lifter, right? Lasha probably snatches 5 to 6 days a week, 4 to 6 days. So he's probably doing like, in our world, the 180 no hook no kick snatch is giant, but he might do 1 or 2 sets there. And that's a maintenance session essentially, right? It's not significant enough to drive his results. Doing 180 for 2 singles is not enough to make him snatch 240. Right? Which is retarded that I'm saying 240. But yeah, the idea would be you take these principles, you take SRA, and you create a system that you can then structure them and say, these are where they all go. The second part of this that probably is the overload component is we want to know, we have a list of things, we know where they go, but really kind of before we did that, we should have had like the overload parameters. What are the overload landmarks for that person for this list? So
well, let's take a quick break for that part.